Hello everyone. Tonight, we're going to travel back in time to a forgotten kingdom, one that flourished in the heart of Africa. You might be surprised to hear this story. It's not about Egypt or Mali, two famous African empires, but about a much lesser known one. This empire had something incredibly valuable at its core, something you use every day, but probably don't think twice about: salt. Now, before you get cozy and drift off to sleep, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to support us. Now, turn off the lights, close your eyes, relax your body, focus on the story, and enjoy the ride tonight. You find yourself standing in the vast, open expanse of an ancient empire. The heat of the African sun beats down on you, but it's not unbearable. The land stretches out around you, full of life, dust swirling in the air. In the distance, a caravan of traders travels across the dusty roads, their carts piled high with goods. Among these goods, something stands out: salt. Yes, salt. It's not the first thing you'd expect to see on a trade route, but here, in this forgotten empire, salt is more valuable than gold. You might find it hard to believe that salt could hold such significance, but in this empire, it's the lifeblood of the economy. You see, salt was once the only reliable way to preserve food in a world without refrigeration. It was a precious commodity, more important than fresh water or even meat. You can almost feel the weight of it in the air as traders haggle over prices. The salt is not just a necessity, it's a luxury too. And what makes this empire's salt so special? It wasn't just about the salt itself. It was the way this kingdom had tapped into the salt trade that made it a force to be reckoned with. Imagine the power of controlling such a valuable resource in a world where people literally couldn't survive without it. The empire didn't just mine salt. It controlled every aspect of its distribution. Every piece of salt was taxed like precious gold. But salt wasn't just valuable in practical terms. It was integral to the empire's wealth and power. The very roads leading into the heart of the kingdom were known as the salt roads. These roads were not just trade routes, they were lifelines. As you walked down these paths, you'd see endless caravans of camels carrying salt, heading for markets in distant lands. You can almost hear the soft clopping of their hooves in the distance, the scent of salt hanging in the air as you follow these traders. In this kingdom, the rulers understood the value of salt more than anyone. They didn't just tax it, they lived off it, built their empire off it. The kings of this land had salt to thank for their wealth and luxury. The palaces were adorned with treasures, and feasts were held on salt-laden tables. Life here was grand for those at the top, and yet despite the empire's wealth, there was an air of mystery about it. Where exactly did this salt come from? The answer is elusive. The salt mines, crucial to the empire's success, were hidden away, their locations shrouded in secrecy. Historians still debate their exact locations, as no one seems to have ever been able to pinpoint the sources with absolute certainty. Some say they were buried deep in the mountains. Others claim they were found near underground rivers. Who knows? But what we do know is this: the salt trade helped build an empire that spanned vast lands, connected disparate cultures, and left an indelible mark on history. Its kings reigned with unparalleled wealth, and their influence reached far beyond the kingdom's borders. Now, you shuffle along the dusty roads, the weight of history hanging in the air around you. The caravan has long since passed, and the land stretches out before you, peaceful and quiet. But as you move through this forgotten empire, there's something odd about the air. It's thick with the scent of salt, and you can't help but notice how every part of life here revolves around it. It's almost as if the very ground beneath you is rich with salt, as though the earth itself is trying to remind you of just how valuable this commodity once was. As you wander through the empty streets of a former trading post, you realize that salt, once as valuable as gold, was the empire's currency, its backbone. You can almost hear the clink of coins, well, salt bricks really, exchanging hands in markets long abandoned. Salt wasn't just something people used to flavor their food. It was traded for goods, used to pay taxes, and even served as a form of currency. Imagine paying for your bread with a block of salt. Sounds strange, right? Yet, in this empire, it was commonplace. It wasn't just the rich who depended on salt either. The farmers in the surrounding areas, who provided the crops that kept the empire fed, had to pay a hefty salt tax. This tax was so significant that it became a part of everyday life. Everyone, from the lowliest farmer to the wealthiest merchant, had to deal with it. The tax wasn't just about salt. It was about controlling the very lifeblood of the economy. You couldn't survive without it, and the empire knew that better than anyone. Historians are still debating whether this practice of taxing salt was a form of exploitation or simply a way to ensure the empire's growth. Some argue that the tax was too burdensome, driving peasants and traders to rebellion. But others claim that the tax system kept the economy flowing smoothly, making sure that the salt was distributed fairly across the empire. The truth is likely somewhere in between, a delicate balance between wealth and poverty, power and oppression. Still, there's something almost magical about the way salt is woven into this empire's story. You can't help but wonder if the salt trade was the true source of the empire's might. After all, salt preserved life in an era before refrigeration, and without it, food would have spoiled, entire cities would have starved, and the empire could never have thrived. Salt wasn't just a luxury, it was survival itself. This empire might have survived longer than most, but without salt, it would have been nothing. As you sit on the edge of what was once a bustling market, now just an abandoned ruin, you think about how something as simple as salt could have shaped an entire kingdom. The power of salt was so great that it became both a blessing and a curse. For the rich, it was a symbol of status. For the poor, it was a constant reminder of their place in the social hierarchy. Yet in a way, the salt tied everyone together, no matter their status or wealth. Perhaps the most fascinating thing about this empire, though, was its resilience. Despite the weight of salt, both literal and figurative, this empire managed to flourish. The roads were built, the salt was mined, and the wealth was distributed, though not always equally. The empire's rulers were not simply traders and merchants. They were master tacticians, understanding that salt was more than just a resource. It was a tool, a lever for control. But as you sit here in the quiet, imagining the hustle and bustle of centuries past, you realize that this kingdom's true strength wasn't just in its salt. It was in its ability to connect the distant corners of Africa, linking cultures, goods, and ideas in a way that most empires of its time could only dream of. Salt was the empire's treasure, yes, But it was the kingdom's reach, its influence, that made it stand out. You keep walking, your footsteps echoing in the silence of the once thriving empire. The air feels heavy with history, and as the sun starts to dip below the horizon, you can't help but wonder how such a powerful kingdom could have faded into the obscurity of time. But here's the thing. The empire didn't rise by chance. It grew, step by step, through determination and an understanding of something very simple yet incredibly valuable: salt. This isn't just a story about wealth or politics. It's about the ability to see opportunity where others might not. At first glance, the kingdom seemed like any other in the ancient world, but it was the ruler's ability to tap into the salt trade that made it extraordinary. They didn't just control the salt mines, they controlled the entire process of extracting, trading, and distributing it. Imagine a kingdom where every step in the salt's journey was carefully managed, each grain of salt tracked as it made its way from the mines to the markets. These rulers understood that controlling such a crucial resource was the key to not just surviving, but thriving. The empire's rise was slow but steady. The kingdom wasn't always the wealthiest or the most powerful, but it had something that no one else could claim: access to a vital resource. Salt, which was as valuable as gold, wasn't just something to be mined and sold. It was something to be guarded, something to be protected at all costs. The kingdom's kings and queens knew that whoever controlled the salt would control the fate of the land, and they acted accordingly. Historians are still debating the exact origins of this empire, when it first rose to power, or how its rulers managed to secure such a monopoly on salt. Some argue that it was through military conquest, while others believe it was a combination of diplomacy and strategic alliances with neighboring tribes. But no matter how it happened, one thing is certain: the empire's rulers were not content with simply possessing salt. They were masters of it, and they wielded it like a weapon, using it to forge an empire that stretched far beyond their borders. As you make your way deeper into the ruins of the capital city, you start to notice the remnants of an advanced civilization. The buildings, though crumbling now, once stood tall and proud, their intricate carvings telling stories of a prosperous past. The roads, though cracked and overgrown with weeds, still trace the path that the salt caravans once traveled. And in the distance, you spot the remnants of what may have been a royal palace. Its once grand entrance now just a shadow of what it once was. But it wasn't just the salt that made this empire so powerful. It was the empire's ability to harness the salt trade for more than just economic gain. Salt was used as a form of currency, a way to exchange goods and services. It was taxed, and those taxes helped fund the kingdom's military, infrastructure, and grand palaces. You can almost see the merchants haggling in the market, paying for goods with slabs of salt. Their transactions carried out with the precision of an empire that understood its power. As you pause to take in the view of the old marketplace, you can almost hear the bustling crowds, feel the energy of a time when salt was more precious than anything else. But salt didn't just sustain life. It built life. It created wealth. It fueled trade. And it solidified the kingdom's place as one of the most powerful in the region. Without it, the empire would have crumbled long before its time. But power, as you know, is never guaranteed. Even the greatest empires eventually fall. And as we'll see, it wasn't just the loss of salt that led to the downfall of this kingdom. It was the changing tides of history, the shifting balance of power, and the arrival of outsiders who sought to take control of the valuable salt trade for themselves. The cool night air begins to settle as you sit quietly among the ancient ruins, contemplating the rise and fall of this forgotten empire. The wind rustles the dry leaves at your feet, and you can almost hear the hum of daily life from long ago. The marketplace would have been bustling, traders shouting their wares, while the smell of fresh bread and cooked meat mixed with the ever-present scent of salt. Salt wasn't just a commodity here, it was a vital lifeline, essential to preserving food. Without it, food would have spoiled in the heat of the African sun, leaving nothing but rot behind. Without salt, life would have ground to a halt. Now, imagine a time when there were no refrigerators. The idea seems strange to us, but in this world, salt was the only way to keep food from decaying. The empire had long since realized the importance of salt in food preservation. Meat, fish, grains, everything that could be salted was salted. The preservation of food allowed this empire to thrive, even in harsh conditions, and trade with distant regions flourished because they could supply salted goods. You can almost hear the clink of salted fish being packed into crates, ready to be shipped off to far-off markets. It was a trade in survival, and salt was the currency that held it all together. As you look around, the ruins of once mighty walls now lie quiet and crumbling. You can almost see the royal merchants moving among the buildings, inspecting the salted provisions that were to be sent to distant cities. The salt wasn't just about preservation, it was about life itself, and the people of the empire understood this better than anyone. It's not just about food. It's about what food represents: continuity, survival, and the ability to thrive where others might falter. Historians still debate how long the salt trade lasted as the central force in this empire. Some argue that the kingdom relied too heavily on salt, neglecting other industries that could have diversified the economy. Others claim that the salt trade was so successful that it became self-sustaining, ensuring the prosperity of the kingdom for centuries. Whatever the case, there's no denying that salt was the kingdom's lifeblood, and it shaped everything from the food people ate to the way they traded, governed, and even lived. But as you sit here, feeling the cool breeze against your skin, you realize that the story of this empire isn't just about salt. It's about the way human beings adapt to their environment. The empire didn't have modern technology, but it thrived by understanding the basic needs of survival and making the most of the resources available. Salt wasn't just a luxury here. It was a necessity, and the kingdom's leaders knew how to use that necessity to their advantage. They didn't just survive. They created a thriving empire around a single resource that would eventually change the course of history. And yet, in the end, salt couldn't protect the empire forever. Time moved on, and as with every great civilization, the empire's reliance on salt became both its strength and its weakness. It's easy to imagine the people of the empire standing on the edges of their great salt mines, gazing out at the horizon, wondering if their world would ever change. They could never have predicted that the very resource they had built their empire on would one day be taken from them. The sun dips lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the ruins around you. The winds whisper through the crumbled buildings, carrying the stories of an empire that once commanded vast territories, its heart beating to the rhythm of salt. You can almost see the salt caravans making their way along the ancient roads, their traders hauling heavy loads through the heat of the day. These salt roads were not just paths. They were the veins through which the lifeblood of the empire flowed. Without them, this great kingdom would have crumbled much sooner. As you walk along what remains of the salt road, you feel the roughness of the cobblestones beneath your feet, worn smooth by centuries of travel. The road twists and turns, disappearing into the horizon where the faint silhouette of a distant mountain range looms. It's easy to imagine the caravans traveling these very same routes, their wheels creaking under the weight of precious salt, making their way to the empire's markets or trading with far-off lands. These routes were the arteries that kept the empire connected to the rest of the world. Without them, trade would have been impossible, and the empire's wealth would have evaporated. You can almost hear the hum of ancient voices as the merchants shouted prices, haggled over salt, and made deals that would shape the future of the empire. Salt, the most coveted resource, was transported in large quantities along these roads, where it would be sold, bartered, and taxed. The empire's rulers knew that by controlling the salt roads, they controlled the very lifeblood of the economy. The roads themselves were not just physical, they were symbolic, representing the power and influence of an empire that stretched across vast lands. And while these roads were vital for trade, they also served as a reminder of the empire's reach. They connected not just cities within the kingdom, but also opened up the empire to distant cultures and civilizations. Traders from the north, south, east, and west all passed through this territory, bringing with them goods, ideas, and cultures that mingled with the kingdom's own. Salt was the gateway to all of this, and without it, the empire's influence would have been severely limited. It's fascinating to think about the infrastructure that supported this kingdom. The salt roads weren't just paths, they were engineered with care, built to withstand the harsh climate and the passage of time. The empire's rulers knew that without proper infrastructure, the kingdom would collapse under the weight of its own success. And so, they invested heavily in these roads, ensuring that their salt reached every corner of the empire and beyond. As you walk further along, you begin to see the remnants of ancient toll stations and waypoints, markers that once collected taxes from those passing through, ensuring that the wealth of the kingdom stayed within its borders. But like all empires, this one eventually faced challenges. The salt roads, though vital, were also vulnerable. Caravans, once protected by the kingdom's vast military, became easy targets for rival groups and invaders. The kingdom's reliance on these roads and the salt trade made them both wealthy and exposed. The first cracks in the empire's armor began to show as competitors rose, seeking to control the valuable resource that had made this kingdom so powerful. Historians still argue about what exactly caused the downfall of the empire. Some point to the rise of external threats, others to internal strife. But one thing is certain. As long as the salt roads remained under the empire's control, it remained a dominant force. Once those roads were compromised, whether by invaders, internal rebellion, or simply the changing tides of history, the empire's grip on its wealth and power began to slip. The salt roads were no longer the empire's lifeline. They became its downfall. As the darkness deepens, you feel a chill running down your spine, not from the cool air, but from the eerie realization that even the most powerful empires are vulnerable to the passage of time. The salt roads, once the kingdom's greatest strength, now lay in ruins. You walk quietly through what was once a bustling trade center, now only a faint echo of its former glory. The wind howls through the skeletal remains of buildings that were once filled with life and activity. The legacy of the salt roads, though still present in the soil beneath your feet, is fading. It's hard to ignore how history often has a way of repeating itself. The empire's wealth was built on its control of the salt trade, and for a time, it seemed like nothing could shake its foundations. But as you continue your journey through the ruins, you begin to see the cracks in the empire's armor. The salt roads weren't just trade routes, they were symbols of the empire's strength and its reliance on salt. They were its arteries, but as the empire grew, so did its vulnerabilities. Historians debate the cause of the empire's downfall, but one thing is certain: the empire's grip on the salt trade was not as secure as it seemed. The salt mines, once jealously guarded secrets, were beginning to show signs of depletion. Rival factions, seeking to gain control of this valuable resource, began to encroach on the empire's borders. And while the empire's kings and queens had once been masters of the salt trade, they were now forced to fight off outsiders eager to claim the prize that had made the empire so prosperous. You can almost hear the sound of distant drums, signaling the approach of foreign invaders. Perhaps they came from the desert, or perhaps from the forests to the south. No matter where they came from, their intentions were clear. They wanted the salt. The empire, once powerful and untouchable, now found itself under siege, not from a single enemy, but from all directions. The salt roads, once the key to the kingdom's prosperity, were now the battlegrounds where the empire's fate would be decided. There's a strange irony to all of this. The very thing that had brought the empire wealth and power was now its undoing. Salt, once its greatest asset, had become a symbol of its weakness. As the empire's salt mines dwindled and its rivals grew stronger, the kingdom's influence began to erode. The salt roads, which had once connected the empire to the farthest reaches of Africa, now became perilous paths, teeming with dangers. Traders who once made their fortunes here now avoided the routes, fearing the bandits and invaders that had taken control of the land. The final blow to the empire, however, didn't come from external invaders alone. The empire's leadership, once unified and powerful, began to fracture. Internal strife weakened the kingdom from within, and as the salt roads became more dangerous, trade dwindled, and the empire's economy crumbled. The once thriving cities that had flourished along the salt roads now lay abandoned, their walls crumbling into dust. The empire that had built its wealth on salt was now a shadow of its former self. You walk through the remnants of a city that was once filled with bustling markets and salt traders, and you can't help but wonder, how did such a great kingdom, built on the very resource that sustained it, come to such a tragic end? Historians are still divided on the cause. Some say it was the depletion of the salt mines that brought the empire down. Others claim that the empire's over-reliance on salt as its primary source of wealth was its fatal flaw. The truth is probably a mixture of both. But one thing is certain: the kingdom's fall was a slow, inevitable process, one that started when the salt roads were no longer safe, and the empire's once strong grip on its resources began to slip. It's strange to think that something as simple as salt, something you probably take for granted, could have such a profound impact on the course of history. But in this forgotten empire, Salt was everything. It was the foundation of the kingdom's power. The reason its rulers were able to build great palaces and host lavish feasts. And yet, it was also the reason the empire ultimately fell, as it became clear that no resource, no matter how valuable, could sustain a kingdom forever. The night has fallen completely now, and the wind carries the whispers of an ancient kingdom's fading glory. The ruins around you seem to breathe, each stone a silent witness to the empire's rise and fall. You sit beneath a cracked archway, your mind adrift in the past. The kingdom may be gone, but the shadow of its once great power lingers. Salt was not just a commodity here, it was the cornerstone of an empire's identity, its wealth, and its downfall. As you lean against the cool stone, you can't help but reflect on the rulers who once sat on thrones made from the same salt they taxed so fiercely. These kings and queens, living in opulence, used the wealth from salt to build towering palaces and host lavish feasts that would be remembered for centuries. The salt trade made them rich beyond measure, but it also isolated them from the very people who had helped create their fortune. It's strange to think about the distance between the rulers and their subjects. The kings and queens of this empire didn't just control the salt, they controlled the lives of everyone who relied on it. Salt taxes were levied not just on merchants, but on farmers and commoners alike. It wasn't unusual for the empire's leaders to live in extravagant palaces, while their subjects toiled to meet the ever-growing demands of the salt tax. Imagine a palace surrounded by luxurious gardens, with walls adorned in gold leaf, and every feast abundant with salted meats, fruits, and delicacies. The wealth that came from salt allowed the rulers to live like gods, above the common struggles of the people. It's easy to picture the lavish dinners held in their honor, surrounded by people in extravagant clothing, while outside the palace walls, the common folk labored under the burden of the salt tax. And yet, despite their wealth and the comfort it afforded, the rulers could not escape the inevitable. The very system that had made them powerful, the control over salt, began to unravel. As the empire's wealth grew, so did the resentment of its people. Farmers and traders, the backbone of the empire, found themselves struggling to pay the salt tax, and rumors of corruption spread like wildfire. The once loyal subjects began to question the very system that had brought the empire so much success. Were the rulers abusing their power? Was the salt trade truly worth the price the people had to pay? Historians have long debated whether the rulers of this empire were simply out of touch with their people, or whether they genuinely believed that their power was divinely ordained, that their control over salt made them untouchable. Some even argue that the kings and queens, intoxicated by their wealth and power, didn't see the cracks forming within their own kingdom. They lived in a bubble of luxury, far removed from the struggles of the people. The walls of their palaces, both literal and metaphorical, insulated them from the growing discontent outside. Yet, as the empire's wealth continued to grow, so did the seeds of its demise. The control over salt, once a brilliant strategy, became a double-edged sword. The rulers had relied too heavily on their monopoly, and with that dependence came fragility. Once the salt trade was disrupted, whether by internal rebellion, external invasion, or a simple shift in the balance of power, the entire foundation of the empire began to crumble. As you sit here in the fading light, the wind seems to carry the faint echoes of the empire's once vibrant life. The laughter from the grand banquets, the sound of merchants calling out their wares, the clatter of coins. The empire was once alive with all the sights and sounds of prosperity. But now, all that remains are the ruins, the memories of a time when salt wasn't just a commodity, but the very foundation upon which a mighty empire was built. The empire's kings and queens may have enjoyed their time of wealth and luxury, but in the end, it was their over-reliance on salt and the growing resentment of the people that led to their downfall. They didn't just lose their grip on power, they lost the very essence of what had made them strong, the people they ruled over. In their quest to hold on to their wealth, they failed to see that the salt they taxed so heavily could no longer sustain them. You let out a quiet sigh as you stand up, taking one last look at the crumbling ruins of the empire. The moonlight casts long shadows across the land, and in the stillness of the night, you can almost hear the distant hum of ancient voices. The story of the forgotten African empire that taxed salt like gold may have faded from history, but the lessons it leaves behind of power, greed, and the fragility of empires remain. The silence of the night deepens, and you feel the weight of history in the air. As you walk through the ruins, your footsteps slow, as if you're treading carefully on the bones of an empire long forgotten. The salt, the lifeblood of this kingdom, still lingers in the air, almost as if it has infused the very earth beneath you. The salt mines, once a source of unimaginable wealth, are now buried beneath layers of dust and time. Yet, even now, you can almost feel the echo of the wealth that once flowed freely, sustained by salt. It's hard not to think about the way salt, so simple and unassuming, shaped the fate of this empire. Salt wasn't just a luxury, it was essential. Without it, life would have been impossible. It kept the food from spoiling, preserved the harvests, and allowed people to survive in an unforgiving world. It was the very foundation of this kingdom's prosperity. But what happens when something so crucial is taken for granted? When the empire becomes so dependent on a single resource that it can no longer survive without it? The salt trade had made this empire prosperous, but it had also made it vulnerable. When you rely on one commodity for your wealth, it becomes the center of your entire economy. It becomes the thing you fight for, the thing that defines you. And when that resource starts to deplete, when the competition becomes fierce, when the roads are no longer safe, the empire begins to crumble. It's a cycle as old as time. And this kingdom was no exception. Historians are still debating what caused the ultimate collapse of the empire. Some argue that it was the depletion of the salt mines that led to the downfall. Others claim it was the rise of rival powers who sought to take control of the valuable salt trade. But the truth is likely a mix of both. The salt trade was the lifeblood of the empire, but when external forces began to chip away at its control over salt, the empire began to unravel. The salt roads, once bustling with traders, now lay abandoned as invaders and bandits took over the once safe paths. And what of the empire's rulers? They, too, are shrouded in mystery. While the kings and queens lived in opulent palaces, surrounded by wealth and luxury, they were not immune to the forces that ultimately brought the empire down. Was it their arrogance? Their inability to adapt to a changing world? Historians argue that the rulers were so wrapped up in the comfort and excess of their reign that they failed to see the cracks forming in their empire. They clung to salt, believing it would sustain them forever, but failed to diversify, to recognize that they were vulnerable. But even as you reflect on these questions, the answers remain elusive. The kingdom's riches, built on the salt trade, were both a blessing and a curse. As the empire grew, so did its dependency on salt, until it became a weakness rather than a strength. The kings and queens may have enjoyed their palaces and their feasts, but the very salt they so heavily relied upon ultimately turned against them. The wealth that salt had brought them was not enough to protect them from the changing tides of history. You stand at the edge of what was once a grand marketplace, now nothing more than rubble. The echoes of ancient traders haggling over the price of salt seem distant now. But in their day, salt was everything. It was power, it was survival, and it was wealth. And yet, despite its importance, it was salt that played a significant role in the empire's demise. Without it, the empire couldn't exist. And with it, it had become too dependent, too fragile to withstand the pressures of time. Looking out over the land, you realize that this story is not just about salt or about a forgotten empire. It's about the nature of power and wealth and how they can be as fleeting as the very resources they're built upon. This empire, once a mighty force in Africa, was brought down not just by outside invaders or internal strife, but by its own over-reliance on salt. A single commodity that had once brought so much life to the kingdom eventually became the catalyst for its downfall, and so the empire fades into history, leaving behind only ruins and stories. But the lessons it leaves are as clear as the salt that once glistened in the sun. No matter how powerful, no matter how wealthy, all empires are fragile. The resources that sustain us can just as easily destroy us. As you continue your journey through the ancient ruins, you can feel the weight of the empire's story settling in around you. The night is now deep, and the stars above seem to blink with an eerie familiarity. Their distant light feels strangely comforting, but there's an underlying sadness that clings to the land. This empire, once thriving and vibrant, has faded into the dust of time, leaving behind only its whispers, faint echoes of a past that can never be recaptured. You stand before the remnants of a once grand palace, its broken walls now little more than jagged stones jutting into the sky. The opulence that once filled these halls is gone, replaced by silence. This is where the rulers of the kingdom once resided, surrounded by wealth that flowed as freely as the salt from the mines. Yet, despite the luxury that came with controlling such a precious resource, there's something haunting about the emptiness of the palace now. The salt, once so abundant, now lies forgotten in the ruins of a kingdom that believed it could never be defeated. But as history shows, even the mightiest of empires can crumble, their greatness erased by time. As you walk through what remains of the royal gardens, you can almost picture the opulence that once surrounded this place. The kings and queens would have dined on salt-preserved delicacies, surrounded by courtiers and dignitaries. They would have seen themselves as invincible, rulers of an empire built on the foundation of salt. And for a time, they were. But even the richest empires are not immune to the forces of change. The salt that had made them so powerful eventually ran dry, and with it, so too did their power. It wasn't just the depletion of the salt mines that caused their downfall. It was the failure to adapt, to diversify, to recognize that their wealth was fragile. Historians still argue over the exact cause of the empire's fall. Some say it was the arrival of rival empires that sought to take control of the salt trade, while others point to internal corruption and the heavy burden of the salt tax that had grown unbearable for the common people. But there is a deeper, more subtle truth. The empire had become so dependent on its salt resources that it failed to see the larger picture. When the salt trade was disrupted, when the salt roads were no longer safe, the kingdom's economy faltered, and with it, its power. The rulers, once so sure of their position, were blind to the shifting tides of history. As you sit on a stone bench overlooking the remnants of the royal palace, you can almost feel the weight of the kingdom's last moments. The sounds of the past seem to fade in and out, like distant echoes in your mind. You hear the quiet murmurs of the last royal feast, where salt was abundant on the tables, but where the signs of the empire's decline were already present. Perhaps the rulers knew, deep down, that the end was coming, but they clung to their wealth and power, hoping that salt could continue to sustain them. But salt, as they learned too late, cannot protect you from the passage of time. The final years of the empire were marked by unrest, as the people began to rise up against the heavy salt taxes that had once been the lifeblood of the kingdom. Merchants, once wealthy from the salt trade, found themselves powerless against the forces that were gradually chipping away at the kingdom's foundation. The salt roads, once a symbol of the empire's strength, became dangerous and impassable. The once thriving cities along those roads became ghost towns, their markets abandoned, their streets silent. And as the empire's grip on salt loosened, so too did its hold on power. But the most tragic part of this empire's downfall isn't the loss of wealth or territory. It's the loss of potential. The empire, which had once thrived because of its ability to control salt, could have built a future that didn't rely so heavily on one resource. It could have diversified, adapted, and perhaps thrived for centuries more. But instead, the rulers chose to focus on preserving what they already had, never realizing that the world around them was changing, that their monopoly on salt could not last forever. The salt that once brought them prosperity ultimately became their undoing. As the wind picks up, you can feel the chill in the air, and the remnants of the empire seem to shimmer in the fading light. It's as if the very essence of salt still lingers here, in the cracks of the stone and the silence of the night. The salt that built this empire, that gave its rulers their power, has now been swallowed by time. But the lessons it leaves behind are timeless. The ruins stretch out before you in the stillness of the night, their silence a stark reminder of the empire's rise and fall. You can almost feel the weight of time pressing in, as though the very earth beneath your feet is holding its breath, waiting to tell its secrets. As you walk through what was once a thriving city, you pause to imagine what life must have been like here. The streets, once bustling with merchants, soldiers, and traders, are now nothing but remnants of a kingdom that once stood as a powerful testament to salt's value. Salt, the empire's lifeblood, is now just a distant memory. The roads that connected this kingdom to distant lands are no longer traveled, and the once vibrant markets are now empty and quiet. But in those days, the salt roads were the veins through which the empire's wealth flowed. You can almost see the caravans of camels, their heavy loads of salt clinking together, making their way through the deserts, the mountains, and the plains. Salt was not just a commodity, it was the foundation of an entire civilization. The empire's downfall wasn't caused by a single event, but by a slow erosion of its strength. The salt mines that had once provided the empire with its wealth were being depleted. The salt roads, once so well guarded and secure, became dangerous. Bandits and rival kingdoms began to take control of the trade routes, and the kingdom's power started to slip away. But even worse was the growing resentment of the people who had been forced to pay heavy taxes on salt. The very resource that had built the empire now became a burden, one that the common people could no longer bear. You could almost feel the tension in the air as the people began to rise up against their rulers. The empire's kings and queens, once surrounded by luxury, were now faced with the reality of their crumbling kingdom. The people who had once trusted them, who had worked tirelessly to produce and transport salt, were no longer willing to pay the steep taxes that had been levied upon them. The salt that had once been so plentiful, so central to the empire's economy, now became a symbol of oppression. Historians are still unsure about the exact cause of the empire's fall. Some claim it was the depletion of the salt mines, while others argue that the rise of rival kingdoms, eager to take control of the salt trade, was the primary factor. But there's also the possibility that the downfall was a combination of both. The empire had grown complacent, believing that its monopoly on salt would last forever. But as the salt resources dwindled and external pressures mounted, the once mighty empire began to crumble. As you walk through the quiet streets, you can't help but wonder what might have been. Could the empire have survived if it had diversified, if it had relied on more than just salt to sustain it? The answer is unclear. What we do know is that the kingdom's reliance on one resource, one commodity, ultimately led to its downfall. The empire's strength was built on salt, but its vulnerability was rooted in that same salt. The very resource that had brought it wealth and power was the same one that caused its undoing. Salt, once so precious, now lies buried beneath the ruins of the empire. The salt roads, once teeming with life, are now just forgotten pathways in the dust. The kingdom's rulers, once surrounded by luxury, are now little more than a memory. The empire is gone, but its story endures. A cautionary tale of the dangers of over-reliance on a single resource. The empire's rise was built on salt, and its fall was too. It was a resource that provided sustenance, wealth, and power, but also, ultimately, destruction. And as you stand here, in the shadows of what was once a mighty empire, you realize that the story of salt isn't just about the past, it's about the present too. We too build our wealth and power on resources that we often take for granted. But just like the salt that once sustained this empire, these resources can disappear as quickly as they were gained. The empire's rise and fall should remind us of the fragility of wealth, of power, and of the very things that sustain us. The wind picks up as you walk further, and the moonlight casts long shadows across the ancient ruins. The world around you feels like it's holding its breath, waiting for the next chapter of the story. And, as you move through the land that was once ruled by the empire, you can almost hear the faint echoes of the past, whispers of people who once lived here, of traders who passed through, of kings and queens who ruled with salt in their grasp. Their empire was built on this simple yet valuable resource. And yet, In the end, it was the very thing that led to their downfall. The salt that had brought the empire so much wealth, so much power, eventually became its undoing. Historians are still debating the reasons behind the collapse. Some argue that the depletion of salt resources played a central role, while others believe that the empire's downfall was due to a more complex set of factors. Was it the rise of rival powers? The over-reliance on salt? Or was it simply the inevitable decline of an empire that had grown too complacent in its wealth? No one really knows for sure, but what is clear is that the empire's dependence on salt, its sole source of power, ultimately led to its collapse. You can almost imagine what it must have been like for the rulers at the time. Sitting in their grand palaces, feasting on salt-preserved delicacies, surrounded by opulence, they must have thought their wealth would last forever. They had salt, the most valuable commodity in the land, and with it, they controlled everything. The salt roads, which stretched across vast distances, were their highways to wealth and power. But the empire's rulers failed to see the cracks forming beneath them. They relied too heavily on salt, believing that their monopoly would protect them forever. But as the salt began to dwindle, so too did their empire's strength. It's easy to see why the empire's rulers would have been blind to the dangers around them. The salt trade had made them rich, and in their wealth, they became complacent. They didn't anticipate the rising tide of competition or the rebellion of their own people. They didn't realize that relying on one resource, no matter how valuable, could only last for so long. And when the salt was no longer plentiful, when the salt roads were no longer safe, the empire began to unravel. But even as the empire faltered, something incredible began to happen. The very salt that had once defined the empire began to seep into the culture, the traditions, and the stories of the people. The salt trade had connected distant lands, brought together different cultures, and allowed ideas to flow freely across the empire. And as the kingdom faded, these connections did not disappear. They lived on in the form of new alliances, new cultures, and new civilizations that arose from the ashes of the old. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of this empire is the impact it had on the surrounding regions. Even after the empire fell, the salt roads remained vital pathways for trade, and salt continued to play a central role in the cultures that followed. The empire may have disappeared, but the ideas it spread, the connections it fostered, and the lessons it taught were not lost. Salt, once the empire's greatest strength, became its greatest legacy. It is said that the story of this forgotten kingdom still resonates in the lands that once thrived under its rule, like a distant echo, a reminder that even the greatest empires can fall, and that no commodity, no matter how valuable, is invincible. As you stand here, in the shadow of the empire's ruins, you realize that the story of salt is not just about the past, it's about the future too. The world continues to change, and the resources that sustain us today may not be here tomorrow. The rise and fall of this empire remind us that even the greatest power can be brought to its knees by over-reliance on a single resource. Whether it's salt, oil, or anything else, we must remember that no empire, no civilization is immune to the forces of time and change. Salt may have been the foundation of this empire's power, but it also became the catalyst for its demise. As the empire faded into history, so too did the once bustling salt roads. But the lessons remain. And as you stand here, gazing out over the quiet land, you can almost hear the faint echoes of a time when salt was worth its weight in gold, and when it was the very thing that built and destroyed a mighty empire. The cool breeze stirs the leaves around you, the quiet whisper of nature filling the air. You stand on the edge of the ruins, the remnants of a once great empire at your feet. The kingdom, with its vast salt resources and thriving trade routes, has long since faded into the annals of history. But the echoes of its past still linger. The stories of kings and queens, of salt-laden caravans, of markets filled with the clink of coins, are no longer heard. Yet, their shadows remain. As you take in the vast expanse of land around you, a strange sense of perspective washes over you. Here, in the heart of what was once a kingdom built on salt, you begin to realize that the story of this forgotten empire is not simply about salt. It's about the choices we make, about the resources we rely on, and about the cost of neglecting the future while basking in the comforts of the present. This empire, once thriving, ultimately faded because it clung too tightly to what had once made it powerful. Salt was the empire's treasure, its foundation, and its greatest vulnerability. The empire's reliance on salt led to its greatness, but it also set it on a path to ruin. The people, once unified under a common purpose, began to see the cracks in their kingdom's structure. Salt was the reason they could survive in a world where food would otherwise spoil, the reason they could trade with distant lands. But as the salt mines began to deplete, and as rivals and invaders sought to control the salt trade, the kingdom's foundation grew weaker. Those who once flourished in the empire's shadow now found themselves at odds with the very system that had brought them prosperity. The heavy taxes on salt, which had once seemed justifiable, became an unbearable burden for the common people. You walk deeper into the ruins, the path narrowing as you pass broken walls and collapsed structures. The empire's grand palaces, once full of life, now stand as crumbling reminders of what once was. You can almost see the royal guards standing at attention, their faces stern and proud as they protected the wealth that flowed from the salt mines. You imagine the lavish feasts held in the empire's capital, where salted delicacies were served in abundance, and the rulers basked in their own sense of invulnerability. They were the masters of salt, the kings of a land where no one could compete with their wealth. But as the salt grew scarce and the empire's enemies multiplied, those very feasts became a symbol of the empire's blind arrogance. As history often shows, it's easy to become complacent when you've tasted the sweetness of success. But success, no matter how sweet, is fleeting. The empire's rulers, intoxicated by their power and wealth, did not see the signs of the coming storm. They failed to recognize the changes happening around them, both within their own borders and outside them. By the time they realized the extent of their vulnerability, it was too late. The empire's dependence on salt, once its greatest asset, had become its greatest weakness. And as you stand here, in the midst of what was once an empire, you realize that this story is about more than just salt. It's a reminder that all resources, no matter how precious, are finite. No empire can survive forever on a single commodity. There is always a point when things change, when what once sustained you can no longer keep you afloat. And when that happens, you must be ready to adapt, to change, or face the consequences. The rise and fall of this empire, built on salt, is a story that transcends time. It's a tale of hubris, of greed, and of the fragility of even the most powerful civilizations. Salt, the simple mineral that could preserve life, ultimately played a role in the downfall of this once great empire. It served as a reminder of the empire's power and its vulnerability, and as the empire faded, so did the salt that had once been so vital to its existence. As you stand there, looking out over the ruins, you can't help but think about how these lessons apply to our own world today. How many empires, kingdoms, and civilizations have risen and fallen because they relied too heavily on one resource? How many modern nations continue to depend on precious commodities, ignoring the possibility that they too may one day run out? Salt, in its simplicity, reminds us that nothing lasts forever, and that the future is always uncertain. It's a sobering thought, but one that carries with it the wisdom of the ages. In the quiet of the ruins, you feel the weight of this lesson. The empire that taxed salt like gold is long gone, but its story endures. Salt was the foundation of its success, but also the cause of its downfall. And as the wind picks up once more, carrying the whispers of the past, you realize that perhaps, in the end, it was never about the salt at all. It was about the choices we make, the resources we depend on, and the price we pay for ignoring the inevitability of change. As you wander further through the ruins, the night feels as though it's closing in around you, the silence heavy with the weight of centuries of history. The crumbling stone beneath your feet tells the story of an empire that once thrived, built on salt, yet now lies forgotten in the dust of time. The air feels thick, as though the very ground holds the memory of what once was. A land where the salt trade defined the fate of an entire kingdom. But history, like salt itself, has a way of lingering long after its time has passed. The stories of the kingdom, of its kings and queens, and of the people who lived under their rule, are no longer whispered through the halls of great palaces. Yet, these stories still resonate, buried beneath layers of time, waiting to be uncovered by those willing to listen. As you continue through the ruins, your thoughts drift back to the salt. The empire's dependence on it was more than just economic. It was existential. Salt, essential for preserving food, was the empire's greatest resource, its wealth, and ultimately its downfall. It was the one thing that everyone depended on, from the royal court to the common farmer. Yet, despite its crucial role in the kingdom's survival, the salt trade became a burden for the people, taxed so heavily that it became a symbol of oppression. And as the empire's resources dwindled, the salt that had once held everything together began to slip through their fingers. The rise of rival empires, the depletion of salt mines, and the growing unrest among the people were all factors that contributed to the empire's eventual fall. But there's something more insidious at work here, something that goes beyond the external forces that sought to conquer this kingdom. The real reason behind the collapse lies within the empire itself. The rulers, once so sure of their power, became blinded by their wealth. They failed to diversify, to adapt to changing circumstances, and to see the warning signs. Instead of building a future based on sustainability, they clung to their monopoly on salt, never imagining that one day that very resource would be their undoing. As you look out over the crumbled remnants of what was once a thriving marketplace, you can almost feel the energy that once filled the air. Traders haggling over salt, merchants bargaining for the right to transport it along the salt roads. This was the lifeblood of the kingdom, the pulse that kept everything moving. But that pulse has long since faded, replaced by the quiet hum of the wind. It's easy to imagine how the people, once so dependent on salt, began to feel the weight of their dependence. The kingdom had become a giant, supported by the salt trade. But when that foundation began to crumble, everything else followed. The people were left to watch as their rulers, who had once been untouchable, struggled to hold on to power. The empire's leaders were too wrapped up in their wealth and their power to recognize the danger that was closing in. They failed to see that no empire can stand forever on a single resource, no matter how valuable it may seem. You can almost hear the quiet murmur of the people who once lived here, their voices echoing in the night. They must have known, as the empire's decline began to set in, that something was wrong. The salt, once a symbol of the kingdom's wealth, became a reminder of its fragility. And as the empire's resources dwindled, as the salt roads became unsafe and the mines were emptied, the people knew the empire could no longer survive. And yet, even in the face of collapse, something remarkable happened. The salt that had once been the empire's downfall became its legacy. The salt roads may have been abandoned, the mines forgotten, but the connections forged through the salt trade lived on. New alliances, new cultures, and new civilizations arose from the ashes of the old. The salt may have faded, but the influence it had on the world continued. As you stand there in the silence, watching the shadows lengthen across the land, you can almost hear the faint echoes of those who came after the empire's fall. The lessons of the Salt Empire are not just lessons of the past. They are lessons for the present and the future. Empires rise and fall. Kingdoms rise and fall. But the resources they depend on are finite. History, like salt, has a way of repeating itself, and the rise and fall of the Salt Empire serves as a reminder that nothing, no matter how valuable, lasts forever. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of this empire, however, is not the salt it once traded or the riches it amassed, but the lessons it leaves behind. In the end, it was the choices of the rulers, their failure to adapt, and their over-reliance on a single resource that led to the empire's downfall. Salt may have been the empire's greatest strength, but it was also its greatest weakness. And as you leave the ruins behind, you carry with you the story of a forgotten empire, a story of power, greed, and the fragility of even the mightiest of kingdoms. The night seems to deepen around you, the air cooler now as the breeze swirls, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and salt, reminders of a kingdom that once commanded the land. The ruins of this long-forgotten empire stretch out before you, their broken walls and crumbled foundations holding secrets that time has not been able to erase. As you walk through the remains of what was once a bustling center of trade, you can feel the weight of history pressing down upon you, and it becomes almost overwhelming. You stop for a moment, letting the quiet wash over you. The land, though abandoned and desolate, still carries the remnants of a past that shaped the course of history. The empire that taxed salt like gold may no longer exist in the form it once did, but the ripple effects of its rise and fall continue to be felt, even in the present. Salt, once a symbol of power, wealth, and prosperity, now lies buried beneath layers of dust, hidden in the ruins of a kingdom that was too blinded by its success to see its own demise coming. It's almost poetic, isn't it? Salt, the simple, humble substance that allowed the kingdom to grow and thrive, ultimately became the very thing that unraveled it. The empire's over-reliance on salt, its inability to diversify its economy, and its failure to adapt to changing circumstances all played a role in its downfall. The kings and queens of this kingdom, living in opulence, feasting on salted delicacies, were too caught up in the luxury of their wealth to see that their power was fragile. Looking out over the ruins, you realize that the downfall of this empire wasn't just the result of external pressures. It was also the result of internal complacency. The leaders of this empire had everything they needed to create a sustainable future, yet they chose not to. They didn't invest in other resources, in innovation, or in the long-term well-being of their people. Instead, they relied on the salt that had once brought them success. The very thing that had made them rich was the thing that ultimately led to their collapse. And now, as you stand in the midst of their former grandeur, all that remains is a lesson. No empire, no matter how great, can stand the test of time if it refuses to evolve. Historians still argue over the exact cause of the empire's fall. Some say it was the depletion of salt resources. Others point to the rise of rival kingdoms who coveted the salt trade. But perhaps the most compelling argument is that the empire fell because it became too comfortable. The kings and queens believed they could hold on to power forever by controlling salt. But the world around them was changing. Empires, like all things, have a shelf life. Salt could only sustain the kingdom for so long, and when the salt dried up, so did the empire. The salt roads that once connected this empire to the rest of the world are now overgrown with weeds and forgotten by time. The marketplaces where traders once haggled over salt are now silent, their stalls empty. And yet, the legacy of this empire lives on. The salt trade may have ended, but the connections it forged, the cultures it brought together, and the lessons it imparted have not been lost. Perhaps it is in these lessons that the true value of this empire lies. Salt may have been the empire's greatest asset, but it was also its downfall. The kingdom's reliance on this one commodity ultimately led to its collapse as the people grew weary of paying the heavy salt taxes and the salt itself became harder to obtain. But even in its demise, the empire left behind a story of ambition, of growth, of prosperity, and of inevitable decline. It's a story that reminds us all of the fragility of power and how even the most seemingly invincible empires can crumble when they fail to adapt. As you walk away from the ruins, the moonlight casting a soft glow on the land, you feel the weight of history in a way you hadn't before. This empire, like all others, is gone, but its story is not. It is etched into the earth, in the remnants of the salt roads, in the crumbling walls of its palaces, and in the lessons it leaves behind. No empire can stand forever on the foundation of a single resource. And when the tides of time shift, those who fail to adapt will find themselves swept away by the currents of change. The legacy of this forgotten kingdom, built on salt, is one of caution. Salt was once the empire's treasure, but it became its curse. The lesson it imparts is timeless. No matter how great a kingdom may be, it must always be prepared for change. Adapt, diversify, and never take the resources that sustain you for granted. The salt that built this empire may be gone, but its story, its lessons, endure. As you stand at the edge of the ruins, the final remnants of the empire stretching out before you, the silence becomes almost suffocating. The wind has calmed, and the air feels heavy with the weight of the past. The salt that once defined this kingdom, that built its cities, filled its coffers, and sustained its people, is now little more than dust. The roads are empty, the salt mines long abandoned, and the palaces, once opulent with riches, are reduced to crumbled stone. But in this quiet, there is a strange peace. Perhaps that's what history is, a quiet reflection of what came before. Empires rise and fall, their stories etched into the earth and the memory of those who come after. The kingdom that taxed salt like gold is no different. Its story, while forgotten by many, still lingers in the bones of the land, whispering its lessons to those who are willing to listen. As you turn to leave the ruins behind, you can't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. This story, the rise, the power, the fragility, and the fall, reminds you of something important. No empire, no matter how mighty, can stand forever. And it is in the quiet ruins of a forgotten kingdom that you find the most profound lessons. Salt, once worth more than gold, was the foundation of this empire. It gave life to cities and trade, fed the people, and enriched the rulers. But it was also the reason for their downfall. In the end, the salt could no longer hold the empire together. The forces of time, of external pressures, and of internal complacency wore down the kingdom's once strong foundation. And as the salt dwindled, so too did the empire's strength. It is a sobering thought that no matter how powerful we may feel in the moment, the future is never guaranteed. The very things we rely on may one day slip from our grasp, and without adaptability, even the mightiest will fall. But there is another part of this story that resonates deeply. The empire's rise and fall, shaped by salt, was not just a tale of loss. It is also one of adaptation. The lessons learned, even in the final moments of the empire, left an enduring legacy. Though the salt trade may have ended, the connections made, the cultures fused, and the wisdom shared lived on, passed down through generations. The legacy of this empire is not merely in its riches, but in the resilience of those who followed, who adapted and forged new paths when the old ones were no longer viable. As the night settles deeper around you, you realize that the story of this forgotten kingdom is not just a relic of the past, it is part of the present and the future. Salt may have been the empire's greatest wealth, but its true legacy lies in the lessons of fragility and change, of adaptability and innovation. It serves as a reminder to all of us that no empire, no kingdom, and no person is invincible. What we rely on today may not always be available tomorrow, and it is in our ability to adapt to change, to embrace new resources, and to innovate that we find true strength. So as you take one last look at the land that once thrived, you let go of the past. The empire that taxed salt like gold is gone, but its story lives on. Salt, in all its simplicity, carried the empire to greatness and led to its decline. It reminds us that wealth, power, and success are fleeting. But the lessons of the past, The ability to learn, adapt, and grow are what will carry us forward. Now, as you leave these ruins behind, you feel a sense of peace. The story has ended, and though the empire is no more, its message endures. And as you drift off into a quiet, peaceful sleep, the whispers of the past seem to fade away, leaving only the memory of what once was and the wisdom of what remains. The night is quiet now, and the story of the forgotten empire settles gently in your mind, like soft sand drifting to the bottom of a calm sea. You've walked through ruins, imagined bustling markets filled with salt-laden caravans, and glimpsed the grandeur of palaces shimmering in the sun. You felt the pulse of an empire that rose to greatness on something as simple as salt, and saw how that very same salt slowly unraveled its foundations. This was a story about power, wealth, and fragility, about how a resource so essential, so humble, could shape the destiny of a kingdom. Salt gave life, preserved food, connected cultures through sprawling trade routes, and crowned rulers in unimaginable opulence. But as history always whispers, nothing lasts forever. The salt mines dwindled, rivals emerged. The heavy taxes, once tolerable, became chains for the common people. The empire, once brilliant and invincible, could not adapt to change, and like so many before it, it fell. And yet, this is not a sad ending, because in those ruins, in the silence of the salt roads, something remains. A lesson. A gentle reminder that all things, power, wealth, and even the ground beneath our feet, are temporary. That strength lies not in holding on to what we have, but in learning, adapting, and growing. So now, as you lie back and breathe deeply, let that lesson wrap around you like a warm blanket. Let the weight of the world melt away with each slow breath. The ruins are quiet. The night sky glimmers softly above you. You are safe. You are calm. The empire's story has ended, and so has your day. Close your eyes. Drift into dreams as soft as salt on the breeze. Good night.